The reason I wrote the book is that, on the one hand, punk has been written about an awful lot, particularly last year with the 40th anniversary thing. Punk seemed to be in the media all the time. But there's been a tendency really to kind of dilute it and to kind of create this rather safe narrative of punk as this little blip, very colourful, an angry blip in popular music in the 1970s. And what I wanted to do was to go back and historicise it and contextualise it and understand why it continues to haunt and to appear so prevalent within our cultural memory. And so what my book does that other books don't is it's not a chronological history of punk. It's not this band formed then and another band formed a couple of weeks later. It's about the themes that ran through it, trying to locate punk within the context of the social, economic, political and cultural context of the time. What interested me about punk as a youth movement was partly, I guess, personal, because I came of age or became a teenager in the early 1980s, and so punk was still very important then. It still seemed to inform all the kind of youth cultures which were going on around me as I grew up. But what interested punk, particularly for me, was the way in which it endeavoured to engage itself with the world around it. It presented itself as not being escapist, but being something that reflected, related and commented on the world of which it was part. And so I really enjoyed, when I was kind of young, buying the records and also researching it again, finding those record sleeves that had addresses to anarchist bookshops in it, that had references to things like the Spanish Civil War, that gave overviews in fanzines about notions of anarchy and were engaging with the political situation of the time. And it was that something about punk which presented itself as being more than simply popular music that made me intrigued by it and want to go back and really kind of dust it off, really, and look at how it allows us to understand the 1970s and 1980s in a very distinct way. So really what I'm doing is using punk as a lens to understand the 1970s and the 1980s from a youthful perspective. Punk appeared very revolutionary to many people in the 1970s. The further away you get from it and the closer you look to it, you can see the continuities that actually existed with previous countercultures and previous youth cultures and popular music. In some ways, punk was an attempt to go back and recapture the initial excitement of rock and roll when it first started. So it always seemed to be looking forwards and backwards at the same time. But certainly in 1976, 77, it felt very new. It felt very distinct from the rather aging notion of rock that was going on in the 1970s. It was colourful, it was exciting, it was angry. It seemed to, for me, I think what it did was it tapped into a mood and to a sensibility that was developing in the 1970s. And so it became a very kind of radical and expansive youth culture that flew off in lots of different directions in the late 1970s and 1980s. Going off in one direction towards things like new romanticism, and then off in other directions to things like anarcho-punk, and parallel with it was industrial culture, which covered a lot of the same themes. So there just seemed to be an awful lot going on. There seemed to be a lot of depth to punk, which is not saying that other youth cultures didn't have depth, but with punk it seemed very explicit, where often what you can read from other youth cultures was often very implicit. Punk responded to the world of which it was part. First of all, that was primarily a kind of cultural response, I think, really, to young teenagers bored with what was going on around them in terms of music, in the sense of which pop music had lost its way, or rock and roll had lost its way. It was no longer relevant. That facilitated a questioning, really, of why were things the way they were. And the Sex Pistols come framed in political signifiers. Their opening gambit is anarchy in the UK. So there's a politics within that critique. And as a result, punk takes on this notion of being, whether it's anti-establishment or questioning of society, briefly known as dole cue rock in sections of the music, was seen as reflecting what was very evidently going on in British social economics at the time, the rise in unemployment, and all that kind of thing. I think it's often been overstated, and there was a lot more to punk. There was a kind of an existential rumination going on in punk culture as well. But certainly a lot of bands, particularly people like The Clash, picked up on that idea that they were somehow reporting from the front line, that they were giving an account of what life was like for young people on the streets. Punk's legacy is still all around us, really. I mean, certainly it's as a culture, it continues to exist at an underground level and always will do, I guess, in some ways. I've always been more comfortable talking about punk as something you do rather than something you are. It was a process of doing something, doing it yourself, not really caring about what other people think about it, expressing yourself, and that kind of thing. Its wider legacy lives on in graphic design, in fashion, in aesthetics. Without a doubt, it's kind of now become an ingrained part of our cultural fabric, and as a result of that, I think some of what appeared so exciting, for some people threatening about it, has been lost in the kind of as history rolls on. Which again is one of the reasons I want to go back and try and capture something of why it felt so relevant and so exciting at the time. Yeah, more by luck than judgment. The book's kind of coming out at the same time, or roughly the same time, as Never Mind the Bollocks, the first Sex Pistols album came out. In many ways, I think Jon Savage said this in his review of it at the time, is that Never Mind the Bollocks almost felt like the Pistols' tombstone. It was the kind of the end game for them, really. The 4 singles that preceded it had come out. They'd had they made their impact, and everything was beginning to unravel and fall apart. As a record, I think it's a brilliant kind of document of what they did and of their time, with the great Jamie Reed graphics, and capturing essentially not quite all, but nearly all the songs that they'd written at that point. I still think it sounds a great record. It sounds both fresh in its production, but also, like I say, kind of taps into a historical moment and a historical mood. It's a brilliant record. I don't really have a favourite punk record. I like lots of different records and lots of different bands. I always thought punk works best as a 7-inch medium musically. I loved all the stuff like the fanzines and the ephemera that goes with it, and the creativity that went into making those kind of things. I also take quite a broad definition of punk. I don't think it's something you can reduce down to some easy definition. I tend to see it as a creative process of critical engagement. It's using culture to engage critically with the world around you, using whatever tools you've got to hand. So as a result of that, I understand punk as dissolving into lots of different kind of sub-genres as well, within a broader remit. Across that, I like quite a lot of it. So for everything from the Pistols' early records to the independent DIY stuff, bands like 6 Minute War I really like, and Crass's Anarchism. I like the blunt social realism of bands like Early Sham 69 and the Ruts. I find all of it interesting because it was trying to say something and engage with things in a resonant way, and that for me is what was interesting with it. In some ways, it wasn't really about the music for me. It was about the ideas and the fact that people felt the inclination to get up and do something themselves.